Jonathan Williams, 67 years old and proud business owner, standing there in my rented tuxedo while my only son Alexander publicly humiliated me in front of 300 wedding guests. 30 years of sacrifice erased with one cruel sentence. My father-in-law paid for everything. My dad, not even a flower. The silence in that ballroom was deafening. I smiled, walked out, and by morning he had no company, no home, and no inheritance. Before continuing my story, where are you watching from today? Give this video a like if you believe respect matters more than money. I never had anything handed to me on a silver platter. Born to working-class parents in a small town outside Pittsburgh, I learned the value of hard work before I was 10 years old. My father worked in the steel mills, coming home with calloused hands and a tired smile, while my mother cleaned houses to help make ends meet. By 14, I was working weekends at a local hardware store, saving every penny for a future I was determined would be different. After high school, while my friends went to college on their parents' dime, I worked construction during the day and took night classes in business management. Those were grueling years, but they taught me determination. By 25, I had saved enough to start my own small contracting business. Williams Construction began with just me, one truck, and more ambition than capital. The year I turned 30, two life-changing events happened. First, I married Amanda, the love of my life, a kindergarten teacher with a laugh that could light up a room. Second, I secured my first major commercial contract, which put Williams Construction on a trajectory for genuine success. We bought our first home, nothing fancy but ours, and started planning for a family. Alexander was born when I was 33, the proudest moment of my life. I still remember holding him, this tiny, perfect human, promising him I would give him everything my parents couldn't give me. For 4 beautiful years, we were a complete family. Amanda was an incredible mother, and I was building a successful business that would secure our future. Then came the diagnosis: aggressive breast cancer. Despite every treatment available, we lost Amanda just 8 months later. Alexander was only 4 years old, too young to fully understand why Mommy wasn't coming home. The night of her funeral, he crawled into my lap, looked up with those eyes so much like hers, and asked when Mommy was coming back. That moment broke something in me that never fully healed. Suddenly, I was a single father and the sole owner of a growing business. Those first years were a delicate balancing act of grief, parenting, and entrepreneurship. I woke at 5 every morning to prepare Alexander's lunch before dropping him at daycare. Between client meetings, I would call to check on him. After work, I'd race to pick him up, then spend evenings helping with homework, making dinner, and reading bedtime stories. Only after he fell asleep would I pull out the work I'd brought home, often staying up past midnight reviewing contracts and estimates. There were so many sacrifices during those years. When Alexander needed braces, I postponed purchasing new equipment for the company. When he wanted to play baseball, I rearranged my entire work schedule to never miss a game. There were nights I ate ramen noodles so Alexander could have proper meals. Not once did I complain or let him see the strain. My son would have every opportunity I could possibly provide. As Alexander entered his teenage years, our bond grew stronger. He was smart, charismatic, and hardworking, at least back then. Williams Construction was thriving, and I began bringing Alexander to job sites during summer breaks. He showed genuine interest in learning the business, asking thoughtful questions, and impressing my foreman with his quick understanding. Those were some of my happiest memories, watching my son take pride in the family business that would someday be his. When college application time came, Alexander set his sights on prestigious universities. His grades were excellent, and I encouraged his ambition while privately wondering how I would afford the tuition. The night he received his acceptance letter from Princeton, I watched his face light up with excitement. That same night, after he went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table calculating how to make it happen. I ended up taking out a second mortgage on our home and liquidating my personal retirement account. Alexander never knew how much it cost, only that his education was covered. Those 4 years of college transformed my son. He joined business clubs, made connections with children of wealthy executives, and developed sophisticated tastes. During holiday breaks, he would return home with stories about classmates who summered in the Hamptons or whose parents owned multiple homes. I noticed subtle changes in how he viewed our modest three-bedroom house and my practical sedan, but dismissed them as normal growing pains. The day Alexander graduated, becoming the first college graduate in our family, remains one of my proudest moments. Watching him walk across that stage in his cap and gown, I thought of Amanda and how proud she would have been. That evening, over a celebration dinner I had saved months for, Alexander announced he had accepted a position at an elite financial firm in Chicago rather than joining Williams Construction immediately as we had always planned. I swallowed my disappointment and toasted his success, telling myself he deserved the chance to build his own path before taking over the family business. Looking back now, I realize that was the first step on the path that eventually led to that wedding day. But at the time, all I felt was pride in the accomplished young man my son had become, never suspecting how quickly things would change. Alexander thrived in Chicago. Within 6 months, he was already receiving accolades at his firm, and our weekly phone calls were filled with his excitement about the deals he was working on. It was during his second year there that he mentioned Sophia for the first time. She was a colleague, he explained, from a prominent Chicago family with connections throughout the financial world. As the weeks passed, her name appeared more frequently in our conversations. 3 months later, Alexander called to say he was bringing Sophia home for Thanksgiving. I spent days preparing, cleaning the house from top to bottom, planning a traditional meal with all his favorites. When they arrived, Sophia was polite but clearly uncomfortable in our home. She complimented the meal but barely ate, and I noticed her scanning our living room with barely concealed judgment. Alexander seemed tense, constantly jumping to explain or apologize for things that had never bothered him before. The outdated kitchen, the family photos on the walls, even my well-worn recliner where I had read him bedtime stories for years. Shortly after New Year, Alexander mentioned that Sophia's parents, Douglas and Elizabeth Hamilton, had invited me to dinner at their home. The invitation felt like a formality rather than a genuine desire to meet me, but I accepted enthusiastically, wanting to support my son's relationship. I bought a new shirt and tie for the occasion, even splurged on a haircut at a proper salon instead of my usual barber. The Hamiltons lived in a gated community in the most exclusive part of Chicago. Their home was more mansion than house, with a circular driveway and manicured gardens even in winter. A housekeeper answered the door and led me through an entrance hall larger than my entire living room. Douglas Hamilton met me with a firm handshake and an appraising look that made me feel instantly inadequate. Elizabeth Eyre kissed near my cheek, her diamond earrings catching the light as she immediately turned away to check on dinner preparations. That evening was excruciating. Over a meal served by staff on china that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, Douglas interrogated me about Williams Construction. When I explained we were primarily focused on commercial projects in Pennsylvania and Ohio, he responded with, "Ah, a regional operation then," in a tone that made it sound like a terminal illness. Elizabeth asked probing questions about Amanda and appeared disappointed to learn she had been just a teacher. Alexander sat silently through most of the meal, occasionally jumping in to embellish details about the business, making it sound more impressive than the honest, successful company I had built. After dinner, Douglas showed us to his study for brandy, a room filled with leather-bound books and hunting trophies. He casually mentioned the $3 million donation he had just made to his alma mater, watching me over the rim of his glass. When Alexander excused himself to help Sophia with something, Douglas leaned in and said, "Your son has potential. With the right connections and guidance, he might go quite far." The implication was clear. I had gotten Alexander this far, but the Hamiltons would take him the rest of the way. I drove home that night with a knot in my stomach, unable to shake the feeling that I had just been evaluated and found wanting. Over the following months, that feeling proved increasingly accurate. Alexander began canceling our regular phone calls, always with plausible excuses about work demands or social obligations with the Hamiltons. When we did speak, he had endless stories about weekend trips to the Hamptons with Sophia's family, gallery openings, and charity galas where he was meeting important people. 6 months after that first dinner, Alexander called with news. He and Sophia were engaged. I expressed genuine happiness for them, asking when I could expect them for a visit so we could celebrate. There was an awkward pause before he explained that the Hamiltons had already planned an engagement party at their country club. Of course I was invited, but perhaps I should consider staying at a hotel rather than driving back late. Translation: Our home wasn't good enough for an overnight visit anymore. The engagement party was my first glimpse of what the wedding would eventually become. Held at a country club where memberships cost more than most Americans make in a year, it featured champagne towers, an orchestra, and guests who all seemed to know each other from boarding schools and summer homes. I wore my best suit, which marked me immediately as an outsider among men in custom tuxedos. The seating arrangement placed me at a back table with elderly relatives no one wanted to talk to, while Alexander and Sophia circulated among Chicago's elite with Douglas making introductions. During a rare moment when I managed to speak with my son alone, I told him how proud I was and asked about his future plans. Would he and Sophia move back closer to home now? Was he still planning to eventually take over Williams' construction? His response was vague and uncomfortable. "We'll see, Dad. I'm exploring some opportunities Douglas has connected me with. Really exciting potential." That night, as I sat alone in my hotel room, I realized with painful clarity that my son was embarrassed by me. By our home, by the business I had built from nothing, by the very things that had provided him the education and opportunities that led him to Sophia in the first place. The pattern accelerated after the engagement. Alexander and Sophia moved into a luxury apartment in downtown Chicago, paid for by Douglas as an engagement present. When I visited once and expressed admiration for the view, Alexander quickly changed the subject, clearly uncomfortable with acknowledging his father-in-law's financial contributions. Christmas, which we had always spent together even during his college years, was suddenly complicated because the Hamiltons had a tradition of spending the holidays at their ski lodge in Aspen. Alexander promised to visit the week after, then canceled at the last minute due to work commitments. Phone calls dwindled to monthly, then bi-monthly brief conversations. I continued sending birthday and holiday cards with personal notes, received polite but perfunctory thank you texts in response. I extended regular invitations for them to visit, always met with vague promises for when things calmed down. The few times Alexander did visit, he spent most of his time on his phone, making excuses to cut the visits short. A particularly painful moment came when I discovered through social media that Alexander had attended a father-son golf tournament with Douglas. The photos showed them laughing together in matching outfits, captioned, "Great day on the links with Dad." The twist of that knife was especially sharp, as Alexander had declined my invitation for our annual fishing trip that same month, claiming he was too busy with work to take any personal time. With each passing month, I watched my son transform into someone I barely recognized. His language changed, adopting the peculiar dialect of old money with references to summer as a verb and casual mentions of people I was apparently supposed to know by last name only. His clothing, his haircut, his watch, even the way he held himself, spoke of someone desperate to belong in a world that had always been closed to me. Most painful of all, he began making subtle corrections to my table manners, my pronunciation, my stories about our past, always with a quick glance towards Sophia to see if she had noticed his father's gaucheness. Despite all this, I continued loving my son and hoping this phase would pass. I told myself he was just trying to fit into Sophia's world, that once they were married and settled, the Alexander I had raised would return. I couldn't have been more wrong. 10 months before the wedding date, I received a formal invitation to the engagement dinner at the Chicago Athletic Association, an exclusive club housed in a historic building downtown. The invitation itself was thicker than cardstock, with gold embossing and a wax seal. It looked more like a royal proclamation than a family event. The dinner was orchestrated by Elizabeth Hamilton down to the last detail, from the imported flower arrangements to the 7-course meal paired with wines I couldn't pronounce. I was seated at the far end of the table, separated from Alexander by 6 people including Douglas, who spent the evening making toasts and telling stories about my future son-in-law's promising career. When it came time for the traditional father's toast, Douglas stood and spoke for 15 minutes about the couple's bright future, the opportunities he was creating for Alexander at his firm, and the Hamilton family legacy they would carry forward. Then he turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "I'm sure Jonathan would like to say a few words as well." Caught off guard, I managed a brief, heartfelt toast about my love for my son and welcome to Sophia. Later, I overheard Elizabeth telling another guest it was charmingly rustic. After dinner, Douglas pulled me aside to have a man-to-man about the wedding plans. "Elizabeth has everything under control. he explained, swirling expensive scotch in a crystal tumbler. "We've selected the Drake Hotel for the ceremony and reception. The Hamilton name carries some weight there. Got us a prime Saturday in June despite the usual 2-year waiting list." When I asked how I could contribute to the wedding expenses, Douglas waved his hand dismissively. "Not necessary. We want to give the kids the best possible start. I'm sure you understand." The message was clear. My financial contribution wasn't wanted because it couldn't possibly match theirs, and my input on planning wasn't welcome either. Still, I tried to stay involved, calling Alexander regularly to ask about wedding details or offer assistance. Most calls went to voicemail. When we did speak, Alexander was always rushing somewhere, promising to fill me in later on decisions that had already been made. 3 months before the wedding, I still hadn't been consulted on anything beyond confirming my mailing address for the formal invitation. I decided to take a more direct approach and drove to Chicago for a surprise visit, bringing a check for $20,000, a significant sum that represented months of careful budgeting on my part. I wanted to contribute something meaningful to my only son's wedding, even if it wasn't on the scale of what the Hamiltons were providing. Alexander was clearly uncomfortable with my unannounced visit to his apartment. He kept checking his watch and explaining he had dinner plans with Sophia's family later. When I presented the check, he seemed more embarrassed than grateful, quickly tucking it into his pocket with a muttered thanks. "The thing is, Dad," he explained, looking anywhere but at me, "Douglas and Elizabeth have a very specific vision for the wedding. They're working with one of Chicago's top planners, and everything's already been arranged." When I asked about my role in the ceremony, he vaguely mentioned we'd figure all that out closer to the date and ushered me out within 30 minutes of my arrival. As I drove the long hours back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that my son was slipping away from me entirely. The check was cashed the following week with no further acknowledgement. The next blow came when I discovered through Facebook that Alexander had gone on an elaborate bachelor party weekend to Las Vegas, organized by Douglas and attended by what appeared to be primarily Sophia's brothers and their friends. I hadn't even been invited. When I called to ask about the oversight, Alexander sounded genuinely surprised. "Oh, I figured Vegas wasn't really your scene, Dad. It was mostly Sophia's brothers' friends anyway." The fact that he didn't think to include me in any capacity for his bachelor celebration cut deeper than I let on. 6 weeks before the wedding, I received an email from the wedding planner, a woman named Bianca, who communicated exclusively in exclamation points and terms like touch base and circle back. The message detailed the rehearsal dinner that the Hamiltons had planned at the Chicago Yacht Club, along with a schedule for the wedding weekend that made it clear my participation was limited to showing up at the designated times and places. There was even a helpful note about appropriate attire, suggesting the name of a rental place for formal wear since we understand not everyone owns a tuxedo. When I called Alexander to discuss the email, his response was telling. "Dad, please don't make this difficult. The Hamiltons are spending a fortune on this wedding, and Sophia's really stressed about everything being perfect. Just follow the instructions from Bianca and try not to." "You know." "Try not to what, Alexander?" After an uncomfortable pause, he sighed. "Try not to make a scene, okay? This is really important for my relationship with Sophia's family. These people are going to be my in-laws and business connections for life." That conversation finally made me realize something I had been avoiding. Alexander wasn't just marrying Sophia, he was marrying her wealth, her status, and the opportunities her father could provide. Somewhere along the way, my son had decided that climbing the social ladder was worth any price, including our relationship. What Alexander didn't know, what I had never felt the need to broadcast, was that Williams Construction had grown into a very successful enterprise over the past decade. While I maintained a modest lifestyle out of habit and practicality, the company was now valued at approximately $15 million. With commercial properties across 3 states and a reputation for quality that had clients booking projects 2 years in advance. I owned several investment properties that generated substantial passive income and had quietly amassed a portfolio that would have impressed even Douglas Hamilton had I been the type to discuss such things over brandy. The difference was that I had never defined my worth by my bank balance or used it to make others feel small. Alexander, in his rush to impress the Hamiltons, had assumed my continued modest lifestyle meant I was just getting by. He had never bothered to ask about the business's growth or my financial situation. He simply concluded I couldn't possibly contribute anything meaningful to his new sophisticated life. The rehearsal dinner was the final straw before the wedding itself. Held at the Yacht Club with views of Lake Michigan, it was an ostentatious display that had Elizabeth Hamilton's fingerprints all over it, from the ice sculpture of the couple to the custom cocktails named after them. I was seated at a table with distant cousins of the bride who spoke exclusively to each other throughout the meal. Douglas's speech that evening was particularly galling. Standing at the center of the room with a champagne flute raised, he spoke about how proud he was of the man Alexander has become under our guidance these past few years. He talked about welcoming Alexander into the Hamilton family business and how he had always wanted a son to mentor. Throughout this speech, my son nodded and smiled, never once glancing in my direction or acknowledging the 30 years of actual parenting I had provided before the Hamiltons entered the picture. I went back to my hotel room that night and opened the card I had prepared for Alexander, containing a heartfelt letter and a check for $50,000 meant as a wedding gift. Reading over my words about how proud I was of the man he had become, I wondered if I even knew who that man was anymore. Still, I sealed the envelope, determined to give my son this gift and my blessing, regardless of how much he seemed to have forgotten. That night, I barely slept, turning over memories of Alexander growing up. The little boy who had cried on his first day of kindergarten, clinging to my leg. The teenager who had worked alongside me on construction sites during summer breaks, proudly showing off the calluses on his hands. The young man who had promised to make me proud when he left for college. Somewhere along the way, that person had disappeared, replaced by someone who measured worth in designer labels and country club memberships. As dawn broke on his wedding day, I had no idea how completely our relationship would shatter before the sun set again. The morning of Alexander's wedding dawned sunny and clear, the kind of perfect June day that wedding planners dream about. I woke early after a restless night, methodically preparing for the day ahead. The tuxedo I had rented hung on the hotel room door, a reminder that even for my only son's wedding, I was expected to follow someone else's dress code rather than wear the suit I'd purchased for the occasion. As I knotted my tie, I practiced smiling in the mirror, determined to be nothing but supportive regardless of how sidelined I felt. This day wasn't about me. It was about Alexander starting his new life, and I was resolved to be the bigger man despite the months of slights and exclusions. I arrived at the Drake Hotel an hour before the ceremony as instructed. The historic lobby had been transformed with elaborate flower arrangements, each one probably costing more than my first car. A coordinator with a tablet and earpiece intercepted me before I could get my bearings, checking my name off a list and directing me toward a holding area for general wedding participants. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm Alexander's father." The young woman blinked, consulting her tablet again. "Oh, Mr. Williams, I apologize. The wedding party is gathering in the Walton Room on the mezzanine level." When I reached the designated room, it was buzzing with activity. Photographers adjusted lighting, attendants fussed with boutonnieres, and the Hamilton family clustered together taking pre-ceremony photos. Alexander stood in the center of it all, Douglas adjusting his bow tie while a photographer captured the moment. Neither noticed my arrival until I was standing right beside them. "Dad, you're here," Alexander said, sounding oddly surprised, as if he hadn't expected me to show up for his wedding. "You remember Douglas, of course." Douglas extended a manicured hand. "Jonathan, good to see you. Don't you clean up nicely?" The compliment felt more like an observation of surprise than genuine approval. Before I could respond, the wedding planner, Bianca, swooped in to usher everyone into position for more photos. "Family portraits now. Hamilton's to the left, please." I stepped forward, but Bianca's hand shot out. "We'll do the groom with the Williams side in a moment. Let's finish with the Hamiltons first." That moment stretched to 20 minutes of photos featuring Alexander with Sophia's parents, siblings, grandparents, and what appeared to be every Hamilton cousin twice removed. Finally, Bianca turned to me. "Quick one with father and son," she directed, checking her watch. The photographer snapped 2 perfunctory shots before Bianca was already moving everyone toward the ceremony setup. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful, I have to admit. The ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with cascading white flowers and crystal chandeliers casting a soft glow over the proceedings. I sat in the front row, alone on my side, since I had no wife to accompany me, and Alexander had lost touch with most of our family friends over the years. Watching my son stand at the altar as Sophia walked down the aisle on Douglas's arm, I felt a confusing mix of pride and loss. Alexander looked handsome and confident in his custom tuxedo, beaming as his bride approached. This was what every father wants for their child, wasn't it? To see them happy and successful? Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching a performance in which I had been cast as barely more than an extra. After the ceremony, there was another whirlwind of photographs during which I was included in precisely 3 group shots. Then came the cocktail hour where I stood mostly alone, watching Alexander and Sophia circulate through the crowd, invariably accompanied by Douglas, who seemed to be facilitating introductions to important guests. Several times I tried to approach them, only to find them suddenly engaged in what appeared to be urgent conversations with people in expensive suits. A silver bell chimed, signaling guests to move to the reception ballroom for dinner. I followed the crowd, pausing momentarily at the elaborate seating chart to locate my name. Table 19, near the back of the room, far from the head table where Alexander and Sophia would sit with her parents and siblings. My tablemates turned out to be Sophia's former piano teacher, a couple who had been Douglas's neighbors years ago, and an elderly great-aunt who was hard of hearing. None seemed particularly interested in conversation with the groom's father. From my distant vantage point, I watched as the wedding party made their grand entrance, accompanied by professionally choreographed lighting effects and an announcer who pronounced Alexander and Sophia Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton Williams with great flourish. Douglas beamed from the head table, occasionally standing to greet well-wishers who approached to pay their respects. No one came to table 19 except servers bringing the elaborate 7-course meal that I barely tasted. After dinner came the speeches. Douglas spoke first, naturally, delivering what sounded like a practiced oration about legacy, family connections, and his pride in welcoming Alexander into the Hamilton fold. Elizabeth followed with anecdotes about Sophia's childhood and how pleased they were with her choice of husband. Then Sophia's brothers each took turns sharing stories and inside jokes that had the front tables roaring with laughter. Finally, it was Alexander's turn. My son stood, champagne glass in hand, looking confident and at ease, in a way he never had at our dinner table at home. He thanked the guests for coming, spoke eloquently about his love for Sophia, and then turned to acknowledge their families. "I want to thank the people who made this incredible day possible," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the professional sound system. "To Elizabeth and Douglas Hamilton, who have welcomed me into their family with open arms and shown me what it means to be part of something truly special. This amazing wedding is just one example of their incredible generosity." He raised his glass toward the Hamiltons. "My father-in-law paid for everything you see here today, from the flowers to the band to the meal you're enjoying. The man has impeccable taste and an even bigger heart." Then, almost as an afterthought, he glanced in my direction, and my dad. There was a slight pause, followed by what sounded like a rehearsed joke. "Well, not even a flower." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the ballroom. Douglas chuckled loudly, clapping Alexander on the shoulder with obvious approval. Several hundred pairs of eyes swiveled briefly in my direction before quickly looking away in second-hand embarrassment. In that moment, the blood rushed to my face so quickly I felt lightheaded. 30 years of sacrifice, of putting Alexander's needs before my own, of working countless hours to provide him every opportunity, all dismissed and mocked in a single sentence designed to curry favor with his new family. I maintained my composure through sheer force of will. Decades of business negotiations had taught me how to keep my expression neutral even when I wanted to shout. So I smiled politely, raised my glass with everyone else, and sat through the rest of the speeches in a state of numb shock. When the dance floor opened and attention shifted away from the head table, I quietly stood and made my way toward the exit. No one tried to stop me or asked where I was going. At the coat check, I retrieved my keys and phone, then walked through the ornate lobby and out into the warm June night. The drive back to my hotel was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but my mind was eerily calm, processing what had just happened with a clarity that almost surprised me. My son had not just embarrassed me, he had deliberately humiliated me to score points with his new family. The calculated nature of the slight, delivered in front of hundreds of witnesses, revealed exactly how little he valued our relationship. In the privacy of my hotel room, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had transpired. The pain was physical, like a blow to the chest that made it difficult to breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my rented tuxedo, and looked at the wedding card I had brought with me, the one containing the check and my heartfelt wishes for Alexander's future. With deliberate movements, I tore it into tiny pieces and dropped them into the wastebasket. Then, I did something I had not done since Amanda's funeral. I cried. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears of grief for the son I had raised and apparently lost without realizing it. When the tears finally stopped, I felt something shifting inside me, hurt, calcifying into resolve. If Alexander saw me as nothing more than an embarrassment to be minimized and mocked, perhaps it was time I stopped seeing him as the center of my world. I reached for my phone and began making calls. The first was to my attorney, James, who was surprised to hear from me so late but listened carefully to my instructions. The second was to my company's head of security. The third was to my financial advisor. By the time I finally fell into a fitful sleep around 3 a.m, the wheels were already in motion for what would come next. Alexander had made his choice clear to everyone in that ballroom. Now it was time for me to make mine. I awoke at 5:30 the next morning, having slept less than 3 hours. Despite the exhaustion, my mind was remarkably clear. Years of running a business had taught me how to function effectively even when emotions ran high. This situation required the same approach: strategic thinking and decisive action rather than wallowing in hurt. My first call was to James, my attorney of 20 years, and one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial situation. "I need you to meet me at the office at 7, I told him. "Emergency changes to my will, business ownership documents, and trust arrangements." "Everything okay, John?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "It will be," I replied, already mentally prioritizing the day's tasks. While showering and dressing, I contemplated the magnitude of what I was about to do. Alexander had been named in my will as my primary heir, set to inherit not only Williams Construction, but also my personal assets and investment properties. He held the title of vice president in the company, though his actual contributions had been minimal since he moved to Chicago. These arrangements had remained unchanged even as our relationship deteriorated, because I had always believed family businesses should stay in the family. Yesterday had made it abundantly clear that Alexander no longer valued being part of our family. He had made his choice, aligning himself with the Hamiltons and the wealth and status they represented. It was time I respected that choice by removing the safety net he had always taken for granted. James was waiting when I arrived at the office, coffee already brewing in the conference room. "You look like hell," he observed as I closed the door behind me. "Wedding was memorable," I replied dryly, then laid out exactly what had transpired and what I wanted to do in response. To his credit, James listened without interruption, only occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "I've known you a long time, John. You're not a vindictive man, and Alexander is your only child. Are you sure you want to do this?" "I've never been more certain of anything," I replied. "This isn't about revenge. It's about consequences and protecting what I've built from someone who doesn't value it. Alexander has made it clear he's banking on the Hamilton connections for his future. I'm just removing the backup plan he's been taking for granted." For the next 3 hours, we meticulously revised my will and trust documents. Alexander was removed as beneficiary, replaced by a foundation that would be established to provide educational opportunities for children from working-class backgrounds. I officially terminated his position as vice president of Williams Construction, transferring his shares to 5 long-term employees who had actually contributed to the company's growth while Alexander was enjoying the Hamilton lifestyle. "What about the lake house?" James asked, referring to the vacation property Alexander frequently used for weekend getaways with Sophia and her friends. "Change the locks, update the security system, and remove his access code," I directed. "Same for my home and all company properties." By noon, I had signed the revised documents, making them legally binding. James promised to file everything immediately and begin the process of establishing the foundation. Our next call was to Robert Keller, my operations manager who had practically run Williams Construction during the periods when I was raising Alexander alone. "I'm making some significant changes to the company structure," I explained after he arrived. "Alexander is no longer part of Williams Construction in any capacity. His access to company accounts, properties, and systems needs to be terminated immediately. Robert didn't look particularly surprised. He had witnessed firsthand how Alexander's attitude had changed over the years, especially his dismissive treatment of employees who had been with the company since its earliest days. "Consider it done," he assured me. "I'll have IT revoke all his credentials today and change the security protocols. Do you want me to inform the management team?" "I'll handle that," I said, already drafting the email in my head. "Just make sure everything's locked down by end of business today." My next stop was the bank, where I removed Alexander as an authorized user on all my accounts and safe deposit boxes. The bank manager, who had handled my business for over a decade, processed the changes without comment, though I caught the sympathetic glance he exchanged with his assistant. By mid-afternoon, I had contacted the property management company that overseen my real estate investments, instructing them to update security measures and remove Alexander from all access lists. I also spoke with my financial advisor to restructure investments that had previously been earmarked for Alexander's inheritance. Throughout these appointments, my phone remained off. I knew Alexander would eventually realize something was happening, especially when his company credit cards stopped working and his access badges were deactivated. Part of me expected angry calls immediately, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. There would be time for explanations later, after the changes were securely in place. My final meeting of the day was with Stephen Marshall, a business associate who had attended the wedding as my guest. Stephen had witnessed Alexander's speech and my quiet departure afterward. "I was going to call you," he said when we met for a late lunch. "That was beyond inappropriate. Are you okay?" "I'm taking care of it," I replied, then explained the steps I had taken throughout the day. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly since you've been involved in some of our joint ventures." Stephen nodded thoughtfully. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. I've watched Alexander change over the past few years, and not for the better. The way he spoke to some of your employees at the Christmas party last year was concerning. I made excuses for too long," I admitted. "Told myself he was just trying to impress his new connections. Yesterday made it clear it's gone well beyond that." By the time I returned home that evening, I had effectively removed Alexander from every aspect of my business and financial affairs. The decisions had been exhausting but necessary, a clean break rather than a prolonged, messy separation. Sitting in my quiet living room, surrounded by photographs chronicling Alexander's journey from toddler to adult, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. For years, I had structured my life around my son's needs and expectations, even as he grew increasingly distant and dismissive. There was a certain liberation in finally acknowledging the relationship for what it had become and acting accordingly. I turned off my phone completely before heading to bed, knowing the storm would break when Alexander discovered what I had done. For tonight, at least, I would sleep without interruption. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but I had faced worse and survived. This too would pass, leaving me perhaps poorer in family but richer in self-respect. As I drifted towards sleep, my last thought was of Amanda. I wondered what she would think of our son now, and whether she would understand what I had done. Somehow, I felt she would. She had always valued honesty and respect above all else, two things that had been noticeably absent from yesterday's wedding. I allowed myself 3 days of peace. 3 days to ensure all legal changes were properly filed and implemented. 3 days to prepare mentally for the confrontation I knew was coming. When I finally turned my phone back on the morning of the 4th day, the screen lit up with notifications, 35 missed calls, 27 voicemails, and 43 text messages, all from Alexander. The earliest messages, timestamped the day after the wedding, were confused and irritated. "Dad, the company card was declined. Call me back." "Why can't I access the project management system? No one at the office will tell me anything." As the hours progressed, the tone shifted toward anger. "What the hell is going on? Robert says, I've been removed from the company. Call me. You can't just fire me, I'm your son. This is my company too." The 3rd day's messages revealed dawning panic. "The property manager says I'm not authorized to use the lake house anymore. What are you doing? My key doesn't work at your house. Are you seriously changing the locks? James won't take my calls. What have you told him?" The final messages and voicemails, left just hours before I turned the phone back on, were desperate and threatening. "Dad, please call me back. We need to talk about this. Whatever is going on, we can fix it. If you don't call me back, I'm coming over there. This is insane. My lawyer says what you're doing could be considered elder financial abuse. Is that what you want? Legal battles in the family? I listened to each message carefully, noting the progression from entitlement to desperation. There wasn't a single apology or acknowledgement of his behavior at the wedding. He seemed genuinely bewildered that his actions might have consequences. Rather than calling him back immediately, I went about my morning routine, making coffee, and reviewing emails from work. Around 10, my phone rang again. Alexander. I let it go to voicemail, not quite ready for that conversation. 10 minutes later, my doorbell rang repeatedly, followed by aggressive knocking. When I opened the door, Alexander stood on my porch looking disheveled and agitated, a far cry from the polished young executive who had stood making toasts at his wedding. His eyes were bloodshot, his expensive shirt wrinkled, as if he'd driven straight from Chicago without stopping. "What the hell, Dad?" he demanded, pushing past me into the entryway. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Do you have any idea what's been happening?" "I know exactly what's happening," I replied calmly, closing the door. "I initiated it." Alexander paced the living room, running his hands through his hair. "This isn't funny. I can't access any of my accounts at work. The security guard wouldn't let me into the building. Robert says I've been terminated." "Terminated? From my own family's company?" "It's not your company, Alexander. It never was. It was always mine, built by my hands and my sacrifice, with the intention of passing it to you someday. After your performance at the wedding, that someday is no longer coming." He stopped pacing, staring at me in genuine confusion. "The wedding? What are you talking about?" The fact that he didn't immediately understand spoke volumes. The humiliation he had inflicted was so inconsequential to him that he couldn't even connect it to my actions. "You publicly mocked me in front of 300 people, I said, my voice steady. "You told everyone that your father-in-law paid for everything and your actual father couldn't even afford a flower. You made me a punchline to impress Douglas Hamilton." Alexander's expression shifted, first to recognition, then to defensive justification. "That was just a joke, Dad. Everyone was laughing. It wasn't a big deal." "It was to me," I replied simply. "It revealed exactly how you see me now. As an embarrassment to be minimized, a working-class background to be escaped, rather than the father who sacrificed everything to give you the opportunities that led you to Sophia in the first place." "You're overreacting," he insisted, though with less conviction. "It was one comment at my wedding, and now you're, disowning me? Cutting me off completely? That's insane. What's insane is expecting to publicly humiliate your father and face no consequences. Actions have meaning, Alexander. Words have weight. You made your choice clear to everyone in that ballroom. I'm simply respecting your decision by removing the safety net you've taken for granted." He switched tactics, his expression softening into the pleading look that had worked on me countless times throughout his childhood. "Dad, if I hurt you, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way. We can work this out. Just tell me what you want me to do." An apology that comes only after discovering there are consequences isn't really an apology, I pointed out. "You're not sorry you hurt me. You're sorry you're facing repercussions." Alexander's facade of contrition crumbled quickly. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Douglas found out you cut me off from the company. He's questioning whether I'm still a viable investment for him." Sophia is furious. Her parents are talking about having the marriage annulled. And there it was, the real source of his panic. Not our damaged relationship, but the potential loss of his connection to the Hamilton fortune. I felt an odd sense of calm watching the truth finally emerge. So that's what this visit is really about. Not reconciling with your father, but securing your financial future. You're worried Douglas will cut you off if he realizes you don't have a backup inheritance. "It's not like that," he protested, but his eyes darted away, unable to maintain contact with mine. "Tell me something, Alexander. Did you ever mention to the Hamiltons that Williams Construction is now valued at approximately $15 million? That I own commercial properties across 3 states? That my modest lifestyle is a choice rather than a necessity?" His expression answered before his words did. "Why would I? You never talk about money. You still live in this same house, drive the same car. How was I supposed to know?" "You never asked," I said simply. "You assumed I had nothing worth knowing about, nothing worth respecting. You were so busy impressing Douglas that you never bothered to understand what you already had." Alexander's face flushed with anger. "So this is punishment? Teaching me a lesson? I'm 30 years old, Dad. Not a child you can ground when he misbehaves. No, not punishment. Consequences. There's a difference. I've simply adjusted my business and personal affairs to reflect the reality you created. You chose the Hamiltons as your future. I'm respecting that choice. By leaving me with nothing? He demanded, voice rising. After everything we've been through? You have exactly what you worked for, I replied evenly. Your Harvard education that I paid for. Your position at the financial firm that Douglas arranged. Your connections through Sophia. If that's not enough, perhaps you should reconsider your priorities. Alexander's breathing quickened, desperation evident in his voice. My lawyer says I can contest this. You can't just cut off your only son without cause. You're welcome to try. James has assured me everything is legally sound. I didn't act in anger, Alexander. Every decision was carefully considered and properly executed. You'll find the courts have little sympathy for an employed, educated adult whose only complaint is that his inheritance came with conditions he failed to meet. We stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of 30 years and irreversible decisions hanging between us. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought you'd do something like this. I thought no matter what, you'd always be there for me. I was, I said quietly. For 30 years, I was there for every skinned knee, every school play, every triumph and disappointment. I was there when you needed braces and couldn't afford them. I was there working 80-hour weeks to pay for your education. I was there every step of the way until you decided I wasn't good enough anymore. Alexander had no response to that. He stood in my living room looking suddenly younger, more vulnerable than he had in years. For a brief moment, I saw a flash of the boy I had raised, confused and hurt by consequences he hadn't anticipated, but then his expression hardened again. This isn't over, he said, moving toward the door. When you cool down and think about what you're throwing away, call me. Goodbye, Alexander, I replied, not following him to the door. I wish you well with your new family. After he left, I sat alone in my quiet house, feeling the weight of the confrontation but also an unexpected lightness. For the first time in years, I had spoken my truth without tempering it to protect Alexander's feelings or maintain a relationship that existed mostly in my memory rather than reality. 2 weeks later, I received a brief email from Sophia informing me she had filed for an annulment. Irreconcilable differences was the only explanation offered. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that Douglas Hamilton had withdrawn his offer to bring Alexander into the family business once he realized there would be no Williams Construction to merge with or inherit. Alexander made one final attempt at reconciliation, showing up at my office unannounced a month after our confrontation. But it quickly became clear his interest was purely financial, his apology rehearsed and hollow. When I maintained my position, he left with bitter accusations about betrayal and abandonment. It was the last time we spoke, though not the last I heard from him. Occasionally, news would reach me through business associates or distant relatives. Alexander struggling to maintain the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to, taking increasingly desperate measures to stay in the social circles the Hamiltons had introduced him to. Each update brought a mixture of sadness for what might have been and conviction that I had made the necessary, if painful, choice. 6 months passed without any contact from Alexander. In that time, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been subdued during the years of trying to maintain our increasingly one-sided relationship. Without the constant weight of disappointment and rejection, I found myself sleeping better, thinking more clearly, and reconnecting with old friends I had neglected. The first significant change I made was establishing the Williams Foundation, using the funds that would have been Alexander's inheritance. Working with James, I created a scholarship program for students from working-class backgrounds, pursuing careers in construction management, engineering, and skilled trades. The foundation also provided mentorship and internship opportunities at Williams Construction, creating a pipeline of talented, grateful young people who valued the opportunities they were given. Meeting these students, many of whom reminded me of myself at their age, brought an unexpected joy to my life. Their genuine appreciation for the chance to build better futures stood in stark contrast to Alexander's entitlement. Many became like extended family, stopping by for holiday dinners or sending updates about their achievements. One particularly promising young woman, Tara, eventually became my operations manager, bringing fresh ideas and energy to the company. I also made time for new friendships, particularly with other business owners who understood the unique challenges of building something from nothing. A weekly poker game became a highlight, not for the modest sums we wagered but for the camaraderie and honest conversations about business, family, and life's disappointments and triumphs. These were men and women who measured worth by character rather than bank balances, who understood sacrifice because they had made their own. Perhaps the most healing development was my involvement with a grief support group for parents estranged from their adult children. Initially reluctant to share my story, I eventually found comfort in the understanding of others who had experienced similar pain. Through their stories and perspective, I began to see my situation with Alexander not as a personal failure, but as a sadly common outcome when values fundamentally diverge. I learned to hold space for both my grief over what was lost and my determination to live fully despite that loss. As the months became years, the acute pain of Alexander's rejection gradually transformed into a more manageable sadness. I stopped checking social media for glimpses of his life and focused instead on building my own. Williams Construction continued to thrive, expanding into new markets and developing a reputation not just for quality work, but for ethical business practices and community investment. 2 years after the wedding, I was grocery shopping when I turned a corner and nearly collided with a shopping cart. Looking up to apologize, I found myself face to face with Alexander. The shock of the encounter left us both momentarily speechless. He looked different. Gone were the designer clothes and carefully styled hair that had become his uniform during the Hamilton years. He was dressed simply in jeans and a worn sweatshirt, his appearance suggesting someone who had experienced significant change. "Dad," he said finally, his voice hesitant, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I still need to eat," I replied mildly, unsure how to navigate this unexpected meeting. An awkward silence stretched between us before Alexander spoke again. "I'm back in town. Permanently, I mean. I'm working at Bartlett Construction as a project manager." This surprised me. Bartlett was a direct competitor to Williams, smaller but with a solid reputation. I didn't know that. "How long have you been back?" "About 3 months," he replied, shifting uncomfortably. "It's different from what I was doing in Chicago. More hands-on. Actually reminds me of working summers with you when I was younger." I nodded, noting that this was the first reference he had made to our shared past in years without a hint of embarrassment or dismissal. "How are you finding it?" "Challenging," he admitted. "I'm having to relearn a lot of basics. The Harvard MBA doesn't count for much when you're trying to sort out problems on a job site." Something in his tone, a humility I hadn't heard since before college, made me ask, "Would you like to grab a coffee sometime? Catch up properly?" Alexander looked genuinely surprised by the offer. "I'd like that," he said after a moment. "Very much." We exchanged phone numbers, his new one unfamiliar to me, and agreed to meet the following weekend. As we parted ways, there was no dramatic reconciliation, no promises of restored inheritance or positions within my company. Just a small opening, a possibility that hadn't existed before. Our coffee meeting was predictably strained at first. 2 years of silence created a chasm not easily bridged by casual conversation. But as Alexander spoke about his experiences since the wedding, I glimpsed something I had feared was permanently lost: authenticity. He told me about the collapse of his marriage weeks after the wedding, when Sophia realized there would be no Williams Construction merger or inheritance to smooth their path. About Douglas Hamilton withdrawing all support and connections once Alexander no longer served his purposes. About the humbling experience of starting over professionally, applying for positions where his resume impressed, but his lack of practical experience quickly became apparent. "I made a lot of mistakes," he said finally, staring into his coffee cup. "The biggest was forgetting who I was and where I came from, who you raised me to be." It wasn't an explicit apology for the wedding, but it was an acknowledgement, the first step toward genuine accountability. I didn't push for more, understanding that real change happens gradually, through consistent actions rather than dramatic declarations. Over subsequent months, our relationship began a slow, cautious rebuilding. We met occasionally for lunch or to watch a game, keeping conversations light and expectations minimal. I made it clear that while I was open to reconnecting personally, the business decisions remained unchanged. Alexander seemed to accept this, never asking for his position back or mentioning inheritance. What surprised me most was how he began to earn respect on his own terms. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard he was becoming known at Bartlett for his work ethic and willingness to learn from more experienced colleagues, traits that reminded me of myself at his age. He bought a modest home, lived within his means, and occasionally mentioned volunteer work with a youth construction program. One day, nearly 3 years after the wedding, he asked if I would be willing to serve as a reference for a management position he was applying for at a construction firm in a neighboring state. "It's a fresh start," he explained. "Somewhere I can build a reputation based on my own work, not my last name or connections." I agreed, and when the company owner called, I gave an honest assessment of what I knew. Alexander had made serious mistakes of judgment but appeared to be learning from them and recommitting to the values of hard work and integrity he had been raised with. It wasn't an unreservedly glowing recommendation, but it was truthful, which seemed more valuable in the long run. He got the job and moved away again, but this time our communication continued. Occasional calls, holiday visits, a gradually rebuilding relationship based not on obligation or expectation, but on mutual respect. I don't know if we'll ever fully recover what was lost, but I've found peace in accepting what is, rather than mourning what might have been. The experience taught me lessons I never expected to learn at this stage of life, about the difference between giving and enabling, about the courage required to establish boundaries with those we love most, about how true wealth has nothing to do with bank balances or social status and everything to do with character, integrity, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than utility. Most importantly, I learned that standing up for your own worth isn't selfish, it's necessary. By refusing to accept disrespect, even from my only son, I reclaimed not just my dignity but also my capacity for joy, purpose, and authentic connection. Life rarely gives us the endings we expect. My story doesn't have a perfect resolution. No dramatic scene where Alexander fully acknowledges the pain he caused or I magnanimously restore everything he lost. Instead, we have something perhaps more valuable. A relationship, slowly rebuilding on honest foundations rather than obligation or pretense. I sometimes wonder what Amanda would think of all this, whether she would approve of the hard choices I made. In my heart, I believe she would understand that true love sometimes requires difficult boundaries, that enabling someone's worst instincts isn't a gift but a disservice. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have walked away from that wedding reception or stayed? Would you have given Alexander another chance immediately, or held firm as I did? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and consider subscribing to hear more about the complex, sometimes painful lessons life teaches us when we least expect them. Remember, respect can't be bought, only earned. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is insist on it, even when it costs you dearly. Thank you for listening, and I wish you wisdom in your own challenging relationships.